Well, I started life, as I said, as an oceanographer, and I worked in that for a few years in research, and then decided that the only jobs available was sitting on an oil rig looking down a microscope at microfossils, and that wasn't really appealing. So I went off and did some various things. I became a cook, restaurant manager, and so worked in London on ecological parks, and then ended up in the West Country. And by hook or by crook, God knows how, I ended up in the printing industry. And for about nearly 20 years, 3 years in a print company, I then ran my own print-related business for 15 years. In 2002, I'd shut it down. Financially, we hit the rocks. And I decided to go back to my roots. And I went into an energy consultancy, a small energy consultancy here in Rington. And I worked with them for about 3 years. Headed back to Mahuntleth for a master's course in sustainable architecture, and then became a sustainable building consultant. And I've been doing that ever since, until I retired at the end of December last year. So my last few years have been really, since 2010, absolutely focused on passive house housing, which is a German standard and a German building process, which enables us to build houses which quite simply use very, very little energy. It's not difficult, whatever people might say. It is neither difficult nor expensive to build a house. Let me draw you a sort of a parallel. If you think of a teapot, an old 1930s, 1920s house is like a teapot. There's no insulation and it loses heat very quickly. You make a tea and it gets cold. If you put one of those old-fashioned tea cozies around it, you know, with the spout poking out of a hole and the handle poking out of a hole, it stays warm quite a lot longer, but it still gets cold. And that's kind of a 1960s house, or even a 2000 house. A passive house is one that's got a ruddy, great, thick cork mat underneath it and a big tea cozy all the way around it, and it stays hot. So that's the sort of difference. And what you do, you insulate it, you make it airtight, you manage the ventilation, you put in triple glazing, and bingo, you've got a house that uses a few watts to heat it. Costs you a couple of £100 a year.
Right, and I guess this is obviously easy with a new build, because obviously you can build to design. You know, what are the costs or implications for someone who lives in a Victorian or a Georgian house?
Yeah. Absolutely, very good point. Really, really much more difficult. There was a big program by the Technology Strategy Board a few years ago where they basically gave people grants to try things out. And I think there was something in the region of 80 different projects to upgrade existing houses to reduce carbon, reduce energy use by 80%. The average cost of doing that is about 80 grand a house. So that's a lot of money. It's quite difficult to do. And that's why I get very frustrated when I see the sort of government schemes that we've recently seen for green homes improvements that are short term, talking about £5 grand a house. They're badly run. We need to tackle this problem. There are always going to be some buildings that cannot be redeemed, that quite frankly, we may just have to say they've got to go and we've got to replace them. But there's a lot of really good houses, which if the planning rules changed and if there was serious government money thrown at it. I mean, we have thrown a fortune at supporting the economy through the COVID crisis. We could and we should be doing that with UK housing, which is a huge 25–30% of our emissions. It's a big chunk of our emissions, but we've got to throw money at it. And people, individuals, can't afford to do that immediately by themselves. Maybe we do it through the tax system, I don't know, but we need to be throwing a lot more money at it. And then we could do it. We also have a problem that we don't have a supply chain that works yet. We don't have the skilled people. The building industry, quite frankly, is living in the 19th century in terms of its technology. Its business practices are 20th century, and we're in the 21st century. So we need different models. We need training, we need skilled people, and we need cash. And we could do that. The energy companies can be clever. They have embraced things like wind power big time. They're the people who built these wind farms, who paid for these wind farms and bringing those in. And they've got to look at different models, and they are looking at different models. They're not stupid people.
From your experience, how closely do the energy companies and the building industry work together? is there a way that they can actually support each other in insulation and redesigning houses and repurposing houses in any way?
All houses are going to use energy. You don't build a house that doesn't use energy. It's more a case of where does that energy come from and what are you using it for? The space heating in a house, we can cut that down to practically nothing. An ordinary house is a heat sieve. It's like a sieve. If you're carrying water from the tap across the other side of the yard and you've got the choice of a sieve or a bucket, which are you going to use? You're going to use a bucket. Well, we're building heat sieves. A passive house is more of a bucket. And so that bit you can easily cut down. A passive house is essentially a very, very efficient house that does not have a high heat loss.
Right.
And to do that, it must be well wrapped and insulated and well ventilated. I could go into the details of that, but I don't think probably you'll want to hear that on this show today. But we were building houses that work, building houses that have very low heat bills, very low carbon emissions, that are extremely comfortable. They're very even temperatured inside. They don't have drafts. You don't feel cold. The air quality is better. A whole raft of things. Sound penetration is lower with triple glazing and thick walls, all those things. And we were doing it all in natural materials. I work solely in timber frame buildings with timber materials. I'm currently working on a project where we're eliminating all the concrete. We're eliminating practically all of the plastics. We're trying to achieve a truly zero carbon building. So that's embodied carbon when it's built, in operation and in disposal, getting rid of all that carbon, which at the moment you'll see people talking about zero carbon buildings and all they mean is operational energy, how much to heat it and heat hot water, and they forget all the rest of it. Right. So that's sort of where I've been working, if you like. I suppose you would call it the cutting edge of building.
Let's have another tune, and then I'm going to come back to the big controversial subject of the week. That is the airport.